Have information on this case that we think is going to hopefully lead us to solving this case. But it takes time. My team can now focus on what's really the meat and potatoes of this case, and that is who it is that was in that video and who took Nancy Guthrie.
On the night of January 31, 2026, an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie had dinner with her family. She laughed. She played cards. Her son-in-law drove her home. The garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. It closed 2 minutes later. And that was the last time anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. Now here's where this story gets strange. Because within hours, someone had cut her doorbell camera. Her pacemaker went dark at 2:28 in the morning. And drops of her blood were found on the front porch of her Tucson, Arizona home. The FBI called it a kidnapping. The sheriff called it a kidnapping. Her daughter, NBC anchor Savannah Guthrie, went on national television, tears streaming down her face, begging for her mother's return. But somewhere between the ransom notes sent to TMZ, the 2 deadlines that passed in silence, and the DNA that matched no one in the national database, the kidnapping narrative began to crack. 30 former FBI agents, forensic experts, and criminal investigators looked at the same evidence. And they reached a very different conclusion. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 32 days. Her family is still out there, leaving flowers at her front door, posting videos, begging strangers on the internet for answers. The FBI has a tip line. The family is offering over $1 million. And somewhere out there, someone knows something, and has chosen to stay silent. This video gets shared, that changes. Hit subscribe. Share this right now. Because the next person who watches it might be the one who finally recognizes that face. She was born Nancy Ellen Long on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky, a small, quiet city just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. Fort Wright in the 1940s was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Church on Sunday. Neighbors who left their doors unlocked. A world that still moved slowly enough for a child to grow up feeling safe inside it. Nancy grew up, fell in love, and became Nancy Guthrie when she married a man named Charles. Charles Guthrie was the kind of husband who made plans, big ones. He had ambitions in mining, a restless energy that pulled him toward the American Southwest, and eventually toward the wide-open desert landscape of Tucson, Arizona. In the early 1970s, Nancy packed up her life in Kentucky and followed her husband to a neighborhood called the Catalina Foothills, a stretch of elevated terrain sitting just north of Tucson, where the saguaro cacti grow taller than houses and the sunsets turn the Santa Catalina Mountains into something that looks painted. She never left. For more than 5 decades, the Catalina Foothills was Nancy Guthrie's world. She built a life there the way people used to build lives, slowly, intentionally, brick by brick. She raised her children there. She made her friends there. She went to church there. Neighbors knew her by name, by face, by the sound of her laugh. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of person a community anchors itself around. She and Charles had 3 children. A daughter named Annie who would grow up and stay in Tucson, eventually marrying a musician and restaurant owner named Tommaso Cioni. A son named Cameron. And their youngest, a girl named Savannah, who would grow up to become one of the most recognized faces in American television news, the co-anchor of NBC's Today show, a woman whose voice entered millions of homes every single morning. But before any of that, before the television cameras and the national spotlight, there was a tragedy that changed everything. In 1988, Charles Guthrie traveled to Mexico on a mining exploration trip. He was 49 years old. He never came home. He died during that trip, leaving Nancy a widow in her mid-40s with 3 children still at home, including a teenage Savannah who hadn't yet finished high school. Nancy didn't leave. She didn't collapse. She stayed in the Catalina Foothills and she raised her children alone, and she kept going the way people keep going when they have no other choice and every reason to try. By 2026, Nancy was 84 years old. Her health had become fragile, a word Savannah herself would use publicly later when the whole country was listening. Nancy lived with chronic pain. She required daily medication to manage a heart condition and high blood pressure. She wore a pacemaker that monitored her cardiac activity around the clock and synced automatically with her iPhone. Sheriff Chris Nanos would later tell BBC News that without her medication, the situation could become fatal within 24 hours. She lived alone. Her daughter Annie was 4.5 miles away. Her grandchildren were nearby. Her church friends called her regularly. She had, by every measure, a full and connected life. On the evening of January 31, 2026, a Friday, Nancy took an Uber at 5:32 in the afternoon to Annie and Tommaso's home for a family dinner and cards. The evening was, by all accounts, completely unremarkable. Warm. Easy. The kind of evening that doesn't get remembered because nothing about it suggests it should be. After dinner, Tommaso Cioni drove his mother-in-law home. He waited until she was safely inside. He drove away. The garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. It closed at 9:50. And in the hours that followed, quietly, in the dark, in a house where every light had gone out, something happened to Nancy Guthrie that nobody has been able to fully explain since. There is a certain kind of silence that is different from ordinary quiet. It is the silence of a house where someone should be, but isn't. Where the lights are off not because someone went to bed, but because something else happened entirely. Where every object sits exactly where it was left, undisturbed, waiting for a person who is not coming back to move them. That is the silence that waited inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of January 31, 2026. And nobody knew it yet. The garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. For the next several hours, as far as anyone can tell, nothing happened. Nancy was home. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was still. The Catalina foothills sat under a dark Arizona sky the way it always did, elevated above the city, tucked against the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains, the kind of place where people move specifically because they want to feel removed from the noise and disorder of the world below. Nancy Guthrie had lived there for more than 50 years. She knew every sound her house made. She knew her neighbors. She knew her routines. And someone else knew them too. At 1:47 in the morning, the Google Nest doorbell camera mounted at Nancy's front door went dark. Not because of a power outage. Not because of a technical failure. The camera was manually disconnected. Deliberately. By someone who understood that it was there and understood what it was recording. This is the first moment in the official timeline where the night stops being ordinary. Nancy did not have an active Nest subscription. The camera was there, but it was not actively saving footage to the cloud in real time. What investigators would later discover is that Google Nest systems retain residual data in back-end servers even without a subscription. That data would become critical. But on the night of January 31st, when that camera went dark, there was no alarm. No notification. No alert sent to anyone. The house simply went quiet in a new way. 26 minutes later, at 2:13 in the morning, a motion sensor inside the home detected movement. Not a person, just movement. The kind of detection that tells investigators something was happening inside that house in the earliest hours of February 1, 2026, but does not tell them exactly what. Then, at 2:28 a.m., something happened that would become one of the most haunting details in this entire case. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker monitoring app disconnected from her iPhone. A pacemaker of the kind Nancy wore emits a Bluetooth low-energy signal every 2 to 3 minutes. A unique MAC address. A constant quiet pulse that says, "I am here. I'm working. The person wearing me is alive." That signal synced automatically with her phone, transmitted data to her medical team, and kept a running record of her cardiac activity around the clock. At 2:28 a.m. on February 1, 2026, that signal stopped. That is the last known digital trace of Nancy Guthrie. Not a text message. Not a phone call. Not a security alert. A pacemaker signal, blinking out in the dark in a house in the Catalina foothills, while the rest of the neighborhood slept. 8 minutes later, at 2:36 a.m., a Ring camera belonging to neighbors Elias and Danielle Strategoulias, living approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home, captured something on their street-facing lens. 12 vehicles moving through the neighborhood in the span of those early morning hours. Former NYPD Detective Pat Brosnan later analyzed the footage and noted that the vehicle captured at 2:36 a.m. appeared consistent with a Kia Soul. NBC News correspondent Liz Kreutz timed a possible route from Nancy's home to the Strategalius camera during a live broadcast. The timing fit. Investigators looked at it. They studied it carefully. And then, according to a source familiar with the investigation who spoke to TMZ, they ruled it a dead end. The exit points, the direction of travel, the surrounding geography, none of it aligned with the most likely route away from Nancy's home. Another promising thread. Another wall. Then, at approximately 3:01 in the morning, a 911 call came into Pima County Dispatch. The caller reported a woman hanging out of a dark gray or possibly dark blue Chevrolet Malibu, no license plates, screaming, spotted at the intersection of Oracle Road and River Road in Tucson, heading north on Oracle. The location was approximately 3 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The timing was 33 minutes after her pacemaker went silent. Dispatchers logged it. Investigators responded. The lead shot to the top of the pile. And then it dissolved. Sheriff Chris Nanos later told KVOA reporter Jacob Owens, directly and without ambiguity, that the 911 call had been investigated and determined to be unrelated to Nancy's disappearance. No connection. No link. No thread that led anywhere. The morning of February 1st arrived the way mornings do, quietly, indifferently, without regard for what the night had taken. Nancy Guthrie was supposed to join a virtual church service with friends that morning. She had done it many times before. It was the kind of routine that anchors an older person's week. Familiar voices, familiar prayers, the comfort of continuity. She didn't show up. A concerned friend contacted the family. Annie, who lived 4.5 miles away, tried to reach her mother. No answer. She and other family members rushed to the Catalina Foothills home. They arrived at approximately 11 in the morning, nearly 9 hours after the pacemaker went silent, nearly 9 hours after whatever happened in that house had already happened. They found the front door. They went inside. Nancy's cell phone was there, sitting where she had left it. Her wallet was there. Her daily heart medication, the medication that Sheriff Nanos would later tell BBC News could become fatal if missed within 24 hours, was there, exactly where it always was. Nancy was not. The family called 911 at approximately noon on February 1, 2026. And on the front porch of a quiet home in the Catalina Foothills, in a neighborhood where people moved specifically to feel safe, investigators found drops of blood. Nancy Guthrie's blood. Not a pool. Not a scene of obvious violence. Drops. The kind of detail that raises more questions than it answers. The kind of detail that tells you something happened here, but refuses to tell you exactly what. And that, in many ways, is the story of this entire case. Something happened here. But nobody, not the FBI, not the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not the 400 investigators who would eventually work this case at its peak, has been able to tell the world exactly what. When something goes wrong in a quiet neighborhood, when a woman disappears from behind a closed garage door in the middle of the night, there is a version of events that gets told first. It is the version that gets typed into press releases. The version that gets repeated at podiums. The version that travels from local news desks to national broadcasts to the front pages of newspapers in cities that have never heard of the Catalina Foothills. It becomes, very quickly, the only version most people ever hear. This is that version. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos arrived at Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home on February 1, 2026, and within hours made a decision that signaled to every experienced law enforcement observer exactly how seriously he was taking what he had found. He called in homicide detectives. Not missing persons investigators. Not the standard response team you send when an elderly woman doesn't show up to church. Homicide detectives. The people you call when you believe a crime of the most serious nature has already occurred, or is in the process of occurring. The house was designated a crime scene before the sun went down on February 1st. By February 3rd, the FBI Phoenix Field Office had joined the investigation, led by Assistant Special Agent in Charge John Edwards, who stood before cameras and said what federal agents always say at the beginning of a case like this, that every lead mattered, that every tip was being pursued, that the full weight of federal law enforcement was being brought to bear on finding Nancy Guthrie. A multi-agency task force assembled almost immediately. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, search and rescue teams. Police dogs swept the neighborhood. Drones flew the foothills. Aerial resources mapped the terrain. At its peak, on day 17, more than 400 investigators were working this case simultaneously. On February 4, President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that he had spoken personally with Savannah Guthrie and was directing all federal law enforcement to be at the family's complete disposal, immediately. The machinery of a major federal investigation had been set in motion. And the narrative that machine was building, the narrative it would repeat consistently for weeks, was this: Nancy Guthrie had been kidnapped. Then came February 10th. On that date, FBI Director Kash Patel, who had personally visited the Tucson Command Center the day before, released 4 black and white images and 2 short videos to his personal account on the social media platform X. Not through a formal FBI press release. Not through standard law enforcement channels. Through his personal account, to his personal following. What those images showed would define the public understanding of this case for weeks. A figure standing at Nancy Guthrie's front door in the early morning hours of February 1, 2026. Wearing a ski mask that covered everything except a glimpse of a dark mustache beneath the fabric. A detail that former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, speaking on CNN, identified as a potentially critical identifying feature. Long pants. A jacket. Gloves. Sneakers. A handgun holstered near the groin in what a retired FBI supervisory special agent would later describe, with visible frustration, as a $10 holster positioned in entirely the wrong place for anyone with actual firearms training. And on the figure's back, a 25-liter black Ozark Trail hiker pack. The kind of backpack sold exclusively at Walmart when purchased new. Sheriff Nanos called it one of the most promising leads in the case. Investigators began contacting Walmart store managers across Arizona, pulling purchase records going back 30 to 60 days, looking for any credit card or bank transaction that might attach a name to that bag. The figure approached Nancy's front door, raised a gloved hand toward the camera lens, tried to cover it, failed. Then reached toward a potted plant nearby and used its branches to block the camera's view instead. Not the behavior of someone who had done this before. Not the precision of a professional. The clumsy improvisation of someone working it out as they went. The FBI described this individual as a suspect in the kidnapping of Nancy Guthrie. Male. Approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall. Average build. There was, however, a problem. 2 NBC News law enforcement sources later told the network that the images released by Kash Patel had not all been taken on the same day. One image showed the suspect without a backpack, a detail inconsistent with the others. The Pima County Sheriff's Department called any such suggestion purely speculative. But the discrepancy was never fully explained. And ground-level FBI investigators, according to multiple reports, were left puzzled and frustrated. They had wanted the image held back, kept confidential, used quietly to identify the suspect before he knew he was being looked for. Instead, it went to millions of people overnight. The blood and DNA evidence told its own complicated story. Drops of Nancy's blood on the front porch, confirmed by forensic testing. Classified as drops, not a pool. A distinction that matters. Investigators collected 16 gloves from various locations across the search area. Most were discarded as irrelevant. One, found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home in a field near a roadside, was different. The FBI confirmed it appeared to match the gloves visible on the suspect in the doorbell camera footage. DNA was extracted. An unknown male profile. Submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national criminal database, containing the genetic profiles of millions of convicted offenders and arrestees. No match. The DNA at the scene itself was mixed, genetic material from multiple contributors, making it extraordinarily difficult to isolate a single clean profile. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack told Fox News the glove could be very promising, but cautioned that investigators had not yet confirmed whether the DNA inside it matched the DNA found inside Nancy's home. Forensic scientist Peter Valentine, chair of the Forensic Science Department at the University of New Haven, noted that hair, fiber, and trace evidence from anyone who entered and removed Nancy from her home would also be present. The question was whether investigators had found it yet. Then came the ransom notes. On February 2nd, one day after Nancy disappeared, CBS Tucson affiliate KOLD-TV received what appeared to be a ransom letter. Then TMZ received one. Then a second Tucson television station. In total, multiple media outlets received written demands. Not one of those demands was sent directly to the Guthrie family. TMZ founder Harvey Levin confirmed to CNN the specific contents of the note his organization received. The initial demand was $4 million in Bitcoin, to be paid by 5 p.m. on February 5th. If that deadline passed without payment, the demand would escalate to $6 million by February 9th. A later, separate communication received by TMZ was described as highly sophisticated, specifying a different cryptocurrency entirely, with graphic descriptions of what would happen if the demands were not met. TMZ also received a communication from someone who claimed not to be the abductor but to know who was, and who demanded $100,000 in cryptocurrency in exchange for that information. Both deadlines passed. February 6th, nothing. February 9th, nothing. No escalation. No follow-through. No proof of life. No direct contact with the family ever. On February 4th, Savannah Guthrie, standing alongside Annie and Cameron, released a video addressed directly to whoever held their mother. She asked them to reach out. She said the family was ready to listen and willing to talk. She added, carefully, that given how easily voices and images could be manipulated, they needed confirmation. Real confirmation, that Nancy was alive and that someone actually had her. On February 7th, the family released a second video. They said they had received a message and that they understood. They never said what the message was. And then came the arrest that complicated everything. On February 5, 2026, the FBI arrested a 42-year-old man from California named Derek Kella. He had not abducted Nancy Guthrie. He had simply seen a nationally covered kidnapping case and decided to exploit it, posing as the abductor, sending fake ransom texts directly to Annie Guthrie and her husband Tommaso Cioni, attempting to extract money from a family that was already in agony. He was charged with transmitting a demand for ransom with intent to harass. Investigators confirmed his scheme was entirely separate from the other ransom demands. But his arrest raised a question that nobody in law enforcement seemed eager to answer publicly. If one person had already fabricated ransom demands to exploit this case, how confident could anyone be that the other notes were real? On paper, the official story held together. A masked intruder. Blood at the scene. Ransom demands. A desperate family. An 84-year-old woman taken in the night. But underneath the surface of that story, in the details that didn't quite fit, in the behavior that didn't match the pattern, in the silences where there should have been contact, something else was beginning to take shape. And the people who spent their careers inside the FBI knew exactly what they were looking at. There is a moment in every major criminal investigation when the people who have spent their lives working cases exactly like this one stop nodding along, and start raising their hands. That moment came in the Nancy Guthrie case sometime in the second week of February 2026. Not because the evidence stopped coming in, but because the evidence that was coming in had stopped making sense, at least not in the way the official narrative required it to. One by one the experts started talking. Start with the ransom notes. Because this is where the cracks appear first, and once you see them you cannot stop seeing them. In every major kidnapping for ransom in modern American history, the logic of the crime is brutally simple. You take someone. You contact the people who love them. You name your price. You negotiate. The captor and the family are locked in a transaction. Ugly, terrifying, but transactional. Direct. The money flows one way because the communication flows one way first. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the alleged kidnappers never once contacted the Guthrie family. Not a phone call. Not a text. Not a letter slipped under a door. They wrote to TMZ. They wrote to a television station in Tucson. They sent communications to media organizations whose job is to broadcast information to as many people as possible, the exact opposite of what you do when you are trying to conduct a private, controlled ransom negotiation. A retired FBI agent who reviewed the notes identified something else. The language. Specifically, the use of the abbreviation USD when referring to dollars. It is a small thing, easy to overlook. But an American writing a ransom demand, someone operating inside the country targeting a family in Arizona, would almost never phrase it that way. You write dollars. You use the dollar sign. The term USD is the language of international finance, of wire transfers, of people who think about American currency from the outside. It suggested to this agent either overseas origin or deliberate construction. A hoax built to look like something it was not. Then there was the behavior of the masked figure on the doorbell camera. Former FBI agent Johnny Grusin studied that footage carefully. What he saw did not match the profile of a kidnapper executing a planned abduction. The figure was not forcing entry. He was not moving with the speed or precision of someone who had rehearsed this. He appeared, in Grusin's analysis, to be trying to get Nancy to open the door herself, standing at the threshold, attempting to present himself as something non-threatening enough that an 84-year-old woman alone in her home at 2 a.m. would willingly turn the handle and let him in. That behavior, Grusin said, pointed in a specific direction. Either towards someone Nancy already knew, a face that would not have triggered alarm, or towards someone with a cover story credible enough to lower her guard. A utility worker. A neighbor. Someone with a reason to be there that made sense at 2 a.m. in a way that a stranger in a ski mask never could. Former FBI supervisory special agent, a name withheld from public reporting but whose analysis was shared with multiple outlets, looked at the same footage and focused on something different. The firearm. Specifically the way it was carried. Holstered near the groin in what this agent described, without diplomatic softening, as a $10 holster in entirely the wrong position for anyone with actual training. The grip. The placement. The entire presentation of a person who owned a gun but had not spent significant time learning how to use it in a tactical context. Not a trained operative, this agent concluded. Not someone who had been doing this for a long time. Tracy Walder spent years as both an FBI agent and a CIA officer. She looked at this case and arrived at a conclusion she stated with the directness of someone who has investigated enough crime scenes to recognize patterns across them. This was not a burglary gone wrong. Burglars, she explained, do not take victims with them. A living person is a liability, a witness, a complication that slows you down and multiplies your exposure. You take things. You leave people. The fact that Nancy was gone, that she was removed from the property, told Walder that her removal was the point. Not incidental to the crime. The crime itself. And the address, she noted. The Catalina foothills is not a neighborhood you stumble into. It sits above the city, behind gates and winding roads, in a community where residents largely know their neighbors and notice unfamiliar faces. You do not arrive at a specific house in the Catalina foothills at 2 a.m. by accident. Someone chose that address. Someone knew that address. Someone knew who lived there and knew enough about her life to know when she would be alone, when the lights would be off, and when the garage door would have closed for the last time that night. Greg Rogers spent his career as an FBI special agent working cases where the details of how a crime was committed told you more about who committed it than any witness statement ever could. He pointed to the timing. 2 a.m. An 84-year-old woman, alone, asleep. Professional criminals who target homes for property, burglars, thieves, people who want things, do not operate this way. They case a property. They learn the owner's schedule. They wait for the house to be empty and they take what they came for without the complication of a human being in their way. Nobody breaks into an occupied home at 2 a.m, Rogers said, unless the occupied home is the point. Unless the person inside is what they came for. And if that was true, then whoever did this likely knew Nancy. Not as a stranger. As someone she had allowed into her life. A contractor, a healthcare worker, a gardener, someone with legitimate access to her routines and her property who had used that access to map her vulnerability. Andrew McCabe served as deputy director of the FBI. He looked at the images released by Kash Patel and identified something that most viewers had overlooked. Beneath the ski mask, visible in the gap between the fabric and the suspect's upper lip, a dark mustache. A specific physical characteristic. The kind of detail, McCabe noted, that could jog recognition in someone who had encountered this person before. Who had seen that face without the mask. Who might, if the image reached the right eyes, realize they knew exactly who was standing at Nancy Guthrie's front door. Jennifer Coffindaffer is a retired FBI special agent and former SWAT team member whose eye for tactical detail is precise and unsparing. She spotted something in the footage that others had missed. In the suspect's pocket, an object with what appeared to be an antenna. A walkie-talkie, she concluded, or something very close to it. The implication was significant. Walkie-talkies are short-range, untraceable, and entirely invisible to the cell tower data that law enforcement routinely uses to place suspects at crime scenes. If this person was communicating with someone else that night, a driver, a lookout, an accomplice waiting around a corner, they were doing it in a way that left no digital footprint. He may not look sophisticated, Coffindaffer wrote publicly. But he was thinking tactically. Tracy Walder agreed. A walkie-talkie made perfect sense if there was a getaway vehicle involved, allowing coordinated movement without a single traceable ping. Mary Ellen O'Toole spent more than a decade inside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the division that studies the psychology of violent offenders, that builds profiles from crime scene behavior, that understands how the choices a perpetrator makes in the execution of a crime reveal who they are as a person. She spoke with NPR's Steve Inskeep about this case in February and made a point that reframes everything else. Behavior at crime scenes is always purposeful. Every decision, the timing, the equipment, the method of camera tampering, the choice not to force entry, is a data point. And when you read those data points together, they tell a story about a person who knew this location, who had thought about this in advance, and who had a specific reason for choosing Nancy Guthrie. Then came the high-technology efforts, and the moment when even those hit a wall. Investigators worked with the manufacturer of Nancy's pacemaker to understand what could be tracked. The device emits a Bluetooth low-energy signal every 2 to 3 minutes, a unique MAC address, a quiet pulse broadcasting its location to any receiver close enough to detect it. The FBI mounted what an official described to News Nation as sophisticated FBI technology, a signal sniffer device, onto a Pima County Sheriff's Department helicopter and flew it at low altitude, slowly, over the Catalina foothills and surrounding areas, listening for that pulse. Morgan Wright, CEO of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases, and cybersecurity expert Dave Kennedy independently built a drone-based version of the same technology with a detection range of approximately 1,000 feet. They proposed a grid search using multiple drones with AI-programmed flight patterns, arguing it would be faster and more thorough than a helicopter sweep. The technology existed. The will existed. The search went forward. And then President Trump, aboard Air Force One en route to Georgia, spoke about the strategy publicly. He said he did not like the fact that the pacemaker tracking approach had been disclosed before it had produced results. If someone was holding Nancy and understood that her pacemaker could be tracked, he reasoned they would take steps to prevent exactly that. He had separately told the New York Post that he wanted those responsible to face the death penalty if Nancy was not returned alive. Whether the public disclosure compromised the search, whether someone somewhere heard the news coverage and acted on it, remains an open and unanswered question. No pacemaker signal was ever publicly reported as detected. The gun store list offered a different window into how the investigation was thinking. Philip Martin, co-owner of Armor Bearer Arms in Tucson, told Fox News reporter Amalia Roy that an FBI agent had visited his store carrying 3 pages of documentation, names and photographs of approximately 18 to 24 individuals. The agent asked whether any of those people had purchased a firearm at his store in the past year. None of them had. The FBI declined to comment. But the existence of that list told its own story. Investigators had narrowed their focus to a specific pool of people and were working through it methodically. Heather Barnhart brought a different expertise entirely. A digital forensics specialist at the Sands Institute in Celebrite, and one of the investigators who had worked the University of Idaho murder case, She made an observation that cut to the core of what this investigation required. Your phone, she said, is the silent witness to your life. It knows your patterns. It knows your routines. It knows every place you have been and every time you were there. And when someone tries to hide their digital footprint, when the patterns break, when the anomalies appear, that is exactly where investigators need to look. Someone had been at Nancy Guthrie's front door at 2 in the morning. Someone had disabled her camera. Someone had left DNA on a glove found 2 miles from her home. And somewhere in the digital record of the devices and accounts connected to this case, in the patterns and the breaks in those patterns, the answer to what happened that night was waiting to be found. The experts had looked at the same evidence as everyone else. They had simply refused to stop asking why it didn't fit. Every investigation of this size casts a wide net. That is not a criticism. It is the nature of the work. When a woman disappears without a trace, when the evidence is incomplete and the leads are contradictory and the clock is running, investigators pull on every thread available. Some lead somewhere. Most do not. And the people at the end of the threads that go nowhere, drawn into a federal investigation through proximity, resemblance, or circumstance, carry that experience long after the search warrants have been served and the handcuffs have come off. In the Nancy Guthrie case, several people found themselves inside that machinery. None of them have been charged. 10 days after Nancy disappeared, on February 10th, the same day Kash Patel released the surveillance images, law enforcement moved on their first target. His name was Carlos Palazuelos, a delivery driver in Rio Rico, Arizona, 60 miles south of Tucson near the Mexican border. Agents executed a search warrant at his property. Both his front and back doors were reportedly damaged during entry. Palazuelos walked outside and told a Telemundo reporter on camera he had no idea who Nancy Guthrie was. Investigators said he had been stopped because he resembled the masked figure in the footage released that same day. He was released without charges. 3 days later, February 13th, law enforcement moved again. The target was Luke Daly, 37, living 2 miles from Nancy's home, with prior state prison time on drug charges. Around 6 in the evening he was pulled over in his gray Range Rover outside a Culver's restaurant at Camino de Michael and East Orange Grove Road in Tucson. Handcuffed. Held in a police vehicle for 4 to 5 hours. Simultaneously, his 77-year-old mother Mary was detained at their home while agents searched inside. The Range Rover was towed. Attorney Chris Salepi confirmed Daly was the target of 2 federal search warrants that day and stated plainly that Luke Daly had no link to Nancy Guthrie whatsoever. Sheriff Nanos told Fox News Daly had been their person of interest but was cooperative. Both were released without charges. On February 27th, Daly gave his first public interview on True Crime Arizona with host Brianna Whitney. He said investigators refused to explain why he had been targeted. He said he feared being framed for something he had nothing to do with. His mother spoke the same day. ABC News later reported investigators were leaning away from both Daly and Palazuelos as suspects. A second individual drew attention. Kayla Noel Day, 32, was already held at the Pima County Adult Detention Complex on unrelated charges. She refused transport to her February 18th court date. The court rescheduled to February 27th and ordered the sheriff to transport her by any means necessary. Her attorney Nicholas Brereton declined to comment. No law enforcement agency has publicly connected her to Nancy's disappearance. Then there was the man the internet convicted before law enforcement said a word. Dominic Evans, elementary school teacher and drummer for Tucson band Early Black, whose members included Annie's husband Tommaso Cioni. His resemblance to the masked figure was enough for online observers. People showed up at his home. Sheriff Nanos was direct. Evans was going through hell and had been falsely accused. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed the entire Guthrie family, every sibling and every spouse including Tommaso Cioni, had been cleared. On February 26th, a man was taken into custody after allegedly driving past Nancy's home 50 to 100 times. A photographer confronted him, allegedly found a photograph of Nancy on his phone, and alerted authorities. He failed a sobriety test and was charged with driving under the influence. Not connected to the case. Finally, Annie Guthrie's car. Investigators held it for weeks beyond what observers considered standard. Jennifer Coffindaffer addressed this on News Nation on March 1. The vehicle searches had been consent searches, not warrant searches. Probable cause produces warrants. The use of consent told her Annie and Tommaso were not targets. On March 3, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed the car was being returned. Every thread pulled. Every warrant served. Every person of interest released. And still not one arrest. There comes a point in every unsolved case where the official narrative and the available evidence stop moving in the same direction. That point arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case somewhere around the end of February 2026. The kidnapping label had held for nearly a month. It had been repeated so many times across so many broadcasts and headlines and press conferences that it had hardened into assumption. But assumptions are not conclusions. And the people who had spent their careers learning the difference between the two had a different set of answers. 3 theories. Each one serious. Each one supported by named, credentialed investigators who studied the same evidence and reached different conclusions. The first theory is the one law enforcement has never publicly abandoned. Classic kidnapping for ransom. Someone targeted Nancy Guthrie deliberately, took her from her home, and is holding her alive, waiting for the right moment to collect. Sheriff Chris Nanos stated on March 2, 2026, to NBC News correspondent Liz Kreutz, that he personally believed Nancy was alive. He said investigators were definitely closer. He said there was a lot of intel, a lot of leads, and that it was time to go to work. Retired FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell, speaking on News Nation's Brian Enton Investigates, argued that the $1 million reward fundamentally changed the calculus for anyone connected to this crime. If more than one person was involved, and she believed more than one person was, that reward put every accomplice in what she called an air fryer. The question was simply who would break first. It is a coherent theory. Law enforcement is still operating inside it. But its foundations have been eroding since February 6, the date the first ransom deadline passed without consequence. The second deadline passed 3 days later. No proof of life was ever provided. No direct contact with the family ever occurred. Real kidnappers follow through or lose all leverage. The silence that followed those deadlines was not the silence of a negotiation in progress. It was something else. The second theory was articulated most clearly by former FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino. A planned home invasion or burglary that went catastrophically wrong. An intruder entered Nancy's home with one set of intentions, theft, perhaps, or something more personal, and encountered a situation that escalated beyond anything they had planned for. Nancy, 84 years old, fragile, in pain, dependent on a pacemaker, may not have survived the confrontation. And in the aftermath, with a body and no plan, the intruder made a decision that criminals under pressure sometimes make. They removed her. They bought themselves time. The ransom notes that followed, Bongino suggested, may have come from entirely separate individuals who saw a nationally covered disappearance and recognized an opportunity to exploit it. The arrest of Derek Kella proved that this had happened at least once. The question was whether the original notes were equally fraudulent. Former FBI official Christopher Miller added texture to this theory. He described the possibility of a home invasion that went sideways and was then re-engineered into an apparent kidnapping for ransom after the fact. The key detail, he said, was the blood on the front porch. Whatever this crime started as, it began going wrong very quickly. The third theory is the one nobody in mainstream media wanted to say directly. That this was a targeted, premeditated attack on Nancy Guthrie by someone who knew her. Not a stranger. Not a random criminal who stumbled onto her address. Someone with specific knowledge of her routines, her security system, her schedule, and her vulnerability. Tracy Walder built the case for this theory piece by piece. The Catalina Foothills is not a neighborhood you arrive at by accident. The address was chosen. The timing was chosen. The method was chosen. Someone knew that Nancy lived alone. Someone knew that Tommaso Cioni would drop her off and drive away. Someone knew that the lights would be off and the house would be quiet by 10 o'clock. That level of operational knowledge does not come from surveillance of a stranger. It comes from familiarity. Greg Rogers identified where that familiarity most likely originated. Someone in Nancy's life with legitimate access to her property and her patterns. A contractor. A healthcare worker. A landscaper. Someone she had invited in, trusted, spoken to, given information to without realizing what that information would be used for. Someone who had used that access to map everything they needed before February 1st arrived. Johnny Grusin returned to the doorbell footage and made the observation that anchors this entire theory. The suspect was not forcing entry. He was waiting. He appeared to be trying to get Nancy to open the door herself, which means he believed she might. That is not the behavior of a stranger. A stranger in a ski mask at 2 in the morning does not expect an elderly woman to open her front door willingly. Someone who knows her might. Jennifer Coffindaffer added the dimension that transforms this from a solo act into something more organized. The antenna in the suspect's pocket. The walkie-talkie. Short range. Untraceable. Invisible to cell tower data. If someone was waiting in a vehicle around a corner, coordinating movement in real time, this was not an impulsive crime. This was a plan executed by more than one person who had thought carefully about how not to be found. And then there was the medical dimension that Dr. Nicole Saphir raised on Fox News, the possibility that these categories are not mutually exclusive. A targeted attacker arrives at Nancy's door. Nancy, 84, fragile, experiencing chronic pain, has a medical episode during the confrontation. A cardiac event, a stroke, a sudden collapse. The attacker, who may not have intended to kill her, is suddenly holding a situation they did not plan for. And they make the decision that has left 32 days of investigators without an answer. Michael Gould, former Nassau County lieutenant and founder of the NYPD K-9 unit, stated his assessment plainly. Based on historical patterns in cases like this one, and the fact that Nancy had been without her critical heart medication from the moment she left her home, he believed she had likely passed within the first 72 hours. Her remains, he predicted, were most likely within 2 to 5 miles of the Catalina foothills. Elizabeth Smart, who survived her own abduction and has spent years studying what happens to people who disappear, said something on the Lady Gang podcast in February that was difficult to hear and impossible to dismiss. When someone is not found within the first 24 to 48 hours, she said, the probability of their survival drops to nearly zero. 3 theories. 1 woman. No answers. 32 days. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing as of March 4, 2026. 32 days since the garage door closed at 9:50 in the evening. 32 days since the camera went dark and the pacemaker went silent and the drops of blood dried on the front porch of a quiet home in the Catalina foothills. In 32 days the world has not stopped looking. But it has not found her either. The scale of this investigation has been, by any measure, extraordinary. Between the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, the case has generated between 40,000 and 50,000 individual tips. 10,000 hours of surveillance footage have been reviewed. At its peak, on day 17, more than 400 investigators were simultaneously working this case. The chief of detectives at the Pima County Attorney's Office described it as one of the most complex cases investigators had ever handled. And yet the FBI quietly relocated its command post from Tucson to Phoenix. Law enforcement framed it as a shift toward a more analytical phase, the kind of language that is technically accurate and carefully chosen. Agents remained on the ground in Tucson to manage evidence. But the reduction in visible presence was noted by everyone watching. The Pima County Sheriff's Department announced it was refocusing resources specifically to detectives assigned to the case. The language of an investigation that has moved from the urgency of an active search to the patience of a long-term homicide inquiry. Nancy's Catalina Foothills home was released back to the family at the end of February, a procedural signal that the scene had been fully processed, that everything that could be collected had been collected, and that the answers, if they existed, now lived in laboratories and databases rather than on the property itself. On March 3, volunteers arrived at the home with metal detectors. Alex Zabel, who had been searching since February 2, was among them. They swept Nancy's front yard looking for jewelry, small personal items, anything that might have been dropped or discarded in the immediate area. They found nothing. Zabel told Fox News Digital they hadn't found anything but were simply trying to do as much as they could. The reward structure had grown into something without precedent in a case of this kind. The FBI had originally offered $50,000. It doubled that to $100,000. An anonymous Arizona organization connected to 88 Crime and a private donor raised the public total to $202,500. And then, on February 24, Savannah Guthrie stood before cameras and announced that the family was offering $1 million of their own money, payable in cash, anonymously, for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The total combined reward now exceeded $1.2 million. In that same announcement, Savannah said something that signaled a shift in how the family was allowing themselves to think about what had happened. It was day 24, she said. They still believed in a miracle. They still believed their mother could come home. But they also knew she might be lost. She might already be gone. What they needed, regardless of the outcome, was to know where she was. She clarified, specifically, that tips could be made anonymously and that the reward could be paid in cash. She was removing every possible barrier between information and the people who might have it. On March 2, 2026, Savannah Guthrie, Annie Guthrie, and Tommaso Cioni were filmed walking arm-in-arm down the driveway of Nancy's Catalina Foothills home. It was their first public appearance at the property since Nancy had disappeared. They carried yellow flowers. They placed them at the memorial that had grown outside the front of the house. Candles, photographs, handwritten notes, ribbons in the colors Nancy loved. A woman had come by days earlier and stood alone at the memorial and sang "Wind Beneath My Wings." Nobody asked her to. She simply came and she sang and she left. The card the family placed with the flowers read, "Though we are surrounded by so much darkness and uncertainty, our love burns bright. We love you, Mommy. We miss you so much." A Bring Her Home banner had been displayed outside Tucson NBC affiliate KVOA since the day Nancy disappeared. It was still there. Nancy's neighbor and fellow church member Lloyd Anderson told Fox News Digital that he had recently installed cameras at his own home after what had happened on his street. He was not alone. The Catalina Foothills had changed. The feeling of safety that had drawn people to that elevated neighborhood above the city, the feeling that had kept Nancy there for 50 years, had been replaced by something quieter and harder to name. Genetic genealogy remained the investigation's most promising remaining technical lead. The DNA profile extracted from the glove found 2 miles from Nancy's home had returned no match in Cody's. But investigators were working toward uploading it to consumer databases, Ancestry, 23andMe, where a distant relative of the suspect, someone who had never committed a crime in their life, might have submitted their own DNA and unknowingly created the thread that unravels everything. DNA expert Cece Moore had said publicly that if she were the person responsible, she would be extremely concerned. The same technique had identified the Golden State Killer. It had identified the University of Idaho murderer Brian Kohberger. It had a record of reaching people who believed they were unreachable. 32 days. 40,000 tips. $1,200,000 in reward money. And Nancy Guthrie has not been found. There are things we know. And there are things we do not know. And in the space between those two categories, in that silence, in that absence of answers, an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie is still out there somewhere. Here is what we know for certain. On the night of January 31, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was driven home to her Catalina Foothills residence by her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni. The garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. At 1:47 in the morning, her doorbell camera was deliberately disconnected. At 2:13 a.m., motion was detected inside the home. At 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker went silent. Drops of her blood were found on the front porch. A masked figure carrying a Walmart backpack and a $10 holstered firearm was captured on recovered camera data at her front door. A glove found 2 miles away carried unknown male DNA that matched no one in the National Criminal Database. Every ransom deadline passed without consequence. Every person of interest was questioned and released. 400 investigators worked this case at its peak. 40,000 tips came in. 10,000 hours of footage were reviewed. Here is what we do not know. Whether Nancy Guthrie is alive. Who the masked figure is. Whether he acted alone. What happened inside that house between 2:13 and 2:28 in the morning? Where Nancy is right now at this moment as these words are being spoken. Nobody knows. Not the FBI. Not the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Not the 34 experts who studied this case from every angle available to them. What we know is this. A woman born in Fort Wright, Kentucky in 1942, who crossed the country for love and built 50 years of life in the Arizona desert, who raised 3 children alone after her husband died in Mexico, who went to church and played cards with her family and took an Uber to dinner on a Friday evening in January. That woman deserves the truth. Not the version that makes for the easiest headline. The actual truth. Someone out there knows what happened on the night of January 31st, 2026, in the Catalina foothills north of Tucson. And that person has chosen for 32 days to stay silent.